This is the University of Hawaii Maui College, the college on Maui.
Today we begin basic pharmacology principles. And you'll notice as this lecture goes along, the reason I give you the yellow print is so that you guys think that I'm giving you test questions, and you've noticed that that's pretty much true. And for this lecture, we can just assume that the entire lecture is in yellow print, and most lectures I give after that. Well, this is a pharmacology class. It would be nice to know the actual definition of pharmacology, and that's this right here. Pharmacology is the study of substances that interact with living systems through chemical processes, especially by binding to regulatory molecules and either activating or inhibiting normal body processes. Yeah, it's a big set of words, but I'd like you to give some thought to it, because pharmacology is about manipulating already existing regulatory systems in the body and trying to get them to do things that help. In this course, pharmacology is not the memorization of long lists of medications or any of the drug companies' latest products. Some people think that I stay real current with all the brand new things that the drug companies are coming out with, and the only problem with that is many times a lot of the things, the brand new things drug companies come out with are things that the drug companies end up taking off the market. And so I try to spend time on tried and true old classes of drugs and let you see what the similarities are among them. But what this course does intend to teach you is how medications are used to treat and prevent illness. But what I really want to get across to you this semester is to reveal to you the complexity of living regulatory systems, especially human beings. So this course is going to get enormously complex because of all of you are enormously complex. And so keep in mind that that is your fault, not mine. Well, medical pharmacology is the science of substances used to prevent, diagnose, and treat disease. And that seems to make some sense. Toxicology, as in toxic, toxicology is the branch of pharmacology that studies the harmful effects of chemicals on living systems. And a drug, we hear drug used all the time on TV and pop culture. I want you to keep in mind that our definition of a drug is just a little bit different. A drug is any substance that interacts with a molecule or protein that plays a regulatory role in living systems. And so that makes the definition of drug much larger than how it's used out there in TV land. And we're going to come back to this point later next week. Here's a word they throw around all the time like you know what it means: endogenous, endo, meaning inside. Genus, as in Genesis, means the beginning or how it's made. So endogenous substances are made inside of the body. And all of this is written down for you in your notes in the resources section, so please don't get carpal tunnel with all that scribbling. Exogenous, on the other hand, exo, outside, genesis, as in the beginning. Exogenous substances are made outside of the body. Well, hormones are a word that I hear used in all sorts of contexts, but in pharmacology class, hormones mean something different. Hormones are just quite simply endogenous drugs. Hormones are drugs made by the body. Well, I never used this word. This word never came out of my mouth until I read Katsung and started teaching this class. Xenobiotics, xeno meaning different than a human being. Xenobiotics are exogenous drugs. Now, one thing, if you have Katsung's Basic and Clinical Pharmacology or any book written by multiple authors, you'll notice that the authors that write one chapter do not completely agree with the authors that write another chapter. And if you pore over Katzung's clinical pharmacology book very, very carefully, which I'm sure you all do, you might notice slight variations in this definition. But for the purposes of passing this class, xenobiotics are exogenous drugs. Poisons are drugs too, but poisons have almost exclusively harmful effects. Now, plenty of people who teach pharmacology will tell you that all drugs are poisons, but that really just depends on the dose. You can kill anybody with anything based on that definition, and so our definition of poisons is this right here. Poisons are drugs that have almost exclusively harmful effects. Toxins, we hear about toxins all the time and how to get the toxins out of us, but here in this class, toxins are poisons of biologic origin. That means toxins are naturally occurring, all natural poisons, and they are usually synthesized by plants or animals. Well, this is important. We'll use the word receptor all the time in pharmacology. And we can think of receptor as a lock that a key goes into. And so a receptor is a specific molecule, usually a protein, that interacts with a specific chemical, like a key, and then causes a change in the specific molecule, causing a change in the regulatory function. So I want you to spend a little bit of time thinking about keys and locks. If you take a key and you can stick it in the car door and make the car door open. And so we can think of the key as a drug and the lock as a receptor. Well, this word looks like agony. For a very simple reason, we'll use the word agonist all the time in this class. An agonist is any drug that binds to a receptor and activates the receptor. And so here is my phospholipid bilayer that I drew for you at the second lecture. This is a protein receptor, kind of like a lock. And here is a place for the little key to go. And if that key activates this receptor, then it's an agonist and will cause some kind of change in that receptor. Remember, the top of my slides are always the outside of the cell, and underneath the phospholipid bilayer is the intracellular part of my cell. And so here is an agonist that comes in contact with the receptor, and notice it activates the receptor, and the receptor is able to cause some kind of chemical reaction inside of the cell. This is a natural occurring process of the body and how it regulates itself. And so if the agonist comes from inside of the body, if the agonist is made by the body, well, then that agonist would be referred to as a hormone. If that agonist was made outside of the body, we can refer to it as either a drug, preferably. We don't use the word xenobiotic too much in clinical medicine. Actually, not at all. An agonist is any chemical that activates the receptor. Any drug that activates the receptor would be a good way to describe that. Well, I throw this in many cases, when the agonist leaves the binding site, it just deactivates the receptor, and this is what occurs normally, at least in my cartoon series. However, other receptor agonists will permanently activate the receptor. Saw this as a board question. It's kind of a curveball. And so I did want you to know that there are situations where the agonist will make a covalent change to the protein receptor, so that when the agonist leaves the receptor is permanently activated and will remain permanently activated until that receptor is broken down naturally by the body. Well, that brings us to pharmacologic antagonist. A pharmacologic antagonist is any drug that's going to bind to the receptor and prevent the activation of the receptor. And we talk about antagonists all the time in pharmacology. So here again is a receptor, and it comes in contact with an antagonist. And notice the antagonist does not activate the receptor. The agonist is what activates the receptor. So here, because this chemical fits into the lock but does not activate it, then we refer to that as an antagonist. And in this cartoon, this is a competitive antagonist because the antagonist is competing with the agonist at the agonist's binding site. So notice that the agonist cannot activate the receptor in the presence of a competitive antagonist. So there's our definition of competitive antagonist. A competitive antagonist is any pharmacologic antagonist that competes with the binding of agonist at the binding site. Well, that brings us to non-competitive antagonists. And non-competitive antagonists are very commonly used in pharmacology, and so you'll see this term used a lot. Non-competitive antagonist is any antagonist that binds to the site on the receptor other than the agonist's binding site. And so let's see if we have a cartoon of that. Here is a non-competitive antagonist. And notice it has a place somewhere else on the receptor so that it can modulate the function of the receptor. And this is very common in pharmacologic systems, biologic systems. So here's the non-competitive antagonist. Notice it's bound someplace else besides where the agonist will bind. So notice that if the agonist comes along and fits into the receptor, the agonist can't activate the receptor, or at least can't fully activate the receptor because of the non-competitive antagonist. Well, that's all different than a chemical antagonist. A chemical antagonist is any drug that binds directly to an agonist and deactivates the agonist. Well, so here is a chemical antagonist. There it is, right there. Notice it's not going to bind to the receptor. It's going to bind to the agonist and deactivate the agonist. Now the chemical antagonist prevents the agonist from binding to the receptor. Heparin is something that we'll use. We'll call that a blood thinner for now. And protamine is the chemical antagonist of heparin. And I can assure you that they will ask you that on some question, especially in this class, because that's a very typical example of a chemical antagonist. There's another thing called a physiologic antagonist, and I think I explained that in the next lecture. That slide is missing from here. A physiologic antagonist is like histamine and epinephrine. The end result of those two drugs or hormones are exactly opposite of each other, but it's through completely different physiologic pathways, completely different receptors. And so you'll read about physiologic antagonist